Okay, today you're going to learn about APA citation style. The workshop will cover what APA citation style is, why referencing is necessary, what plagiarism is, where you should use APA, when APA is not required, how to use it, including some examples for references and in-text citations, also about APA format and some resources to help you understand and apply the principles of APA. APA stands for American Psychological Association. They're the group that developed the APA citation style about 80 years ago. APA is used in science-related programs and fields, in the social sciences, applied sciences, and in many health-related fields. One thing I want to let you know is that you're not expected to memorize the rules for APA. There are far too many rules to try and remember. What you want to do is understand the concepts. So by working your way through this workshop, you'll be able to understand some of the concepts about APA, and then you're going to use the guide that's available from the library. It's either available in paper form at the reference desk of the library, or you can click on the links that you'll see here within this presentation, steering you towards different pages in the guide. I'm going to do that now so that you can see what the guide looks like, and as I said throughout the presentation, you'll be referring to it. So it's called the APA Citation Style Guide to Bibliographic Citation. Make sure if you are using an APA guide, you're looking at the 6th edition, because that's the most up-to-date version. So first off, we're going to talk about why referencing is necessary. Referencing is needed so that you can give credit to someone who created an idea, a theory, a concept. If you had worked hard to develop something or create something, you'd want to be given credit or acknowledgement for your hard work as well. So that's one of the reasons referencing is required. Another reason is so that your reader can find the information and research in more depth, looking at the information that you consulted. So for instance, if you looked at a book and you provided some source information within your paper or presentation about that book, your reader could then go back and look at that book and read perhaps another chapter or read further into the material to gather more information. It allows them to cross-reference. Also, referencing is needed so that you can establish your credibility as a writer. When you are providing current, up-to-date, credible information and referencing it correctly, it establishes your credibility as a writer. Your reader is more likely to believe what you're saying and see that you've done due diligence to give credit where credit is due. Also, when you reference, you present the information in a very consistent format. I usually say to students that APA is really rather boring. There's no creativity involved. Having that consistency in format is good for you as a reader. When you're looking at information that's written in APA format, it allows you to locate that information and find the source material. Also, when someone is reading your document, it allows them to do the same thing. So if you're providing the information in a consistent format using APA, your reader is going to be able to locate the information that you looked at. And finally, and probably most importantly, referencing helps you avoid plagiarism. We're going to talk about what plagiarism is in the next slide. So plagiarism is when you don't acknowledge the creator or author of words or ideas. If you don't give credit to the person who originally thought of the idea or wrote about it, then that's a form of stealing. And much like if I were to take a cell phone or take someone's car, that's stealing. I can be charged criminally for that. Plagiarizing is a form of academic dishonesty, really a form of academic theft. And if you don't acknowledge where you got your information from, it's considered plagiarism. Post-secondary institutions have policies regarding plagiarism and academic integrity, and I'm just going to show you Durham College's policy. So as you can see, Durham College has a policy on academic integrity, and it defines what academic integrity is, which is the pursuit of scholarly activity in an open, honest, and responsible manner. And within that definition, academic dishonesty covers things like copying from someone else, collaborating without permission, plagiarizing. And plagiarizing, as I said before, is when you don't acknowledge where you got your information from. In the policy, it outlines the student's responsibility and the responsibility of Durham College employees with matters pertaining to academic integrity. As well, the college has a procedure for handling issues of academic integrity, and you'll see here that there are steps that are taken by, for instance, the professor, by the associate dean, and by the dean. One of them is what's called an academic alert, and that's put into a student's file who has breached academic integrity policy, including plagiarism. The consequences for breaching academic integrity policy range from getting a 0 on the assignment to withdrawal from the course, and that's just on the first offense. So plagiarism is treated very seriously. It's up to students to understand these concepts, and that's why I'm glad you're listening to this workshop and understanding or learning about how to reference things correctly so you don't get accused of plagiarism. One thing that is important is that when you're researching, you need to be able to keep track of where you're getting your information from. If you go on the internet and are looking at multiple websites and minimizing and maximizing and cutting and pasting, that's very dangerous. It's easy to lose track of where you're getting your information from, and if you can't record or if you can't cite, reference things correctly, you can't use the information. So it is important to carefully keep track of where you are getting your information from, whether that's from a book or an interview or a lecture or a website and so on. I'm going to show you a document that is very handy for helping you keep track of your information. It's called a research notes form, and you can get these from the SALS website in the writing section. As well, you can come into SALS and print them off. What you'll see is a space to record your source information, and that would be your author, your www, your title of the document, the year of publication, and so on. If it is a source that has page numbers, it allows you space to put the page number. Also to write your notes, and those notes could be in quotation marks. So for instance, if you want to quote a definition word for word, you would put quotation marks right in your notes. If you decide, no, you know what, I think I can summarize or paraphrase the information, then in this spot you might want to make some point form notes, and then over here you would write your plan. You would indicate whether or not it was a quote or a paraphrase, a definition, and where you think you might want to include that information. What this does is it helps you to stay organized, and it also helps you to get the necessary information you'll need to be able to use APA correctly. So I've talked a lot about APA, or sort of introduced it and why referencing is important, so now we're going to go into where you need to reference. Referencing for using APA appears in two places. One is at the end of your paper in what's called references. It's a detailed list that comes at the end of your paper. It's listed in alphabetic order, and it includes all the sources you use. So whether that's a book or a website or an article or an interview, putting the information, and there's a set format that you have to do it in, but putting the information on the references page in alphabetic order allows your reader to quickly locate the information, all the sources that you used. You may be familiar with the term bibliography or works cited. In APA it's called references. The other part of APA, and it's not one or the other, it's got to be both, references and in-text citations. In-text citations appear right in your paper, and usually in parentheses, in brackets, you would have the author's last name, the year that the source was published, and also the page number if there is one. So that would go in the body of your paper or in your presentation, and it would match with the source information that you'll see on your references page. So whatever you've got as an in-text citation must have a references entry at the end of your paper, and whatever you have as references would have corresponding in-text citations in the body of your paper. You'll see more of this when we take a look at some examples. Now, before we get into the examples of referencing and in-text citations, I want to let you know that there are a couple of things you don't need to reference. So when you're using APA, or any citation style for that matter, there are some things that are considered common knowledge. And common knowledge is information that's widely known and accepted, we say, by educated people. So for instance, cows give milk, babies cry, Canada has 10 provinces and 3 territories. Those kinds of pieces of information don't need to be referenced. And actually they really wouldn't be all that pertinent for a college level paper anyways, but common knowledge does not need to be referenced. If you're not sure whether something should be referenced, or if you're not sure if it's common knowledge, you can ask your professor. The other thing is just reference it. So for instance, if there's a piece of information that you think, well, I keep hearing this over and over again in my courses, I think it would be considered common knowledge. If you're not sure, I would still reference it. I would go and find a source that is credible, up to date, record the source information, and then just reference the information. The only other thing that doesn't need to be referenced is your opinion. So if you believe, for instance, that college tuition should be free for the first year for college students, that would be nice. If you believe that, then that's your opinion. How you support that opinion needs to be referenced. So for instance, if you gather statistics about the average college student's debt, or you get information about, how much money students earn while they're in school, or how long it takes people to earn a college diploma. Any information that you use to back up that opinion must be referenced, but your opinion, the belief or the thought that you have that first year tuition should be free, that's your opinion. That does not need to be referenced, but the other material does. So again, when you're looking at references, it's a detailed listing of all the sources you used. It's at the end of your paper listed alphabetically by author's last name. Sometimes it happens that your author, and actually this frequently happens, that your author is not an individual, but it's a company or the government or an organization. In that case, they would still go in the author position. So for instance, if you looked at Statistics Canada as one of your sources, Statistics Canada would be on your references page, it would be S. If it was General Motors, it would be G. So it would go in alphabetic order according to the author's last name, and if it's not an individual author, then by the company or organization or government. The punctuation is the same for everything throughout an APA document. It's going to be double spaced. You're going to use single spacing after punctuation. And when you're looking at the references page, you have, I'm going to show you actually, I'm going to click on the references page here. And on the very last page of the APA guide, on page 18, is an example of what your references page would look like. So you can see that the title's references. On the left-hand side is where you have your author's name. Again, it could be an organization or it could be an individual. You type along in the order of the type of source that you're following. So for instance, each source has a different format, slightly different format you have to follow. We'll look at some examples in a second. You type along until you run out of room on that first line, then you tab in and you finish off the reference. So there's a set format. As I said, there's no creativity involved. There's just a certain order that you have to put the information in. So when you're using the APA guide, and I won't flip back to it right now, but when you're using the APA guide, the key to using it is figuring out what type of source you're looking at. So if the guide is divided into two parts really, there's the print sources and then there's the electronic or web sources. So if you're looking at print materials, and that could be something like a book, a Toronto Star newspaper article, a Time magazine article, not something that you got online and printed, but an actual print source, something that appears in print in its original form. You would look at the front part of the guide on pages 4 to 9, and you would find the source that matches with your source. So I've provided some examples here. Here's the format for a book by a single author. I'll just point out a couple of picky things. So it goes with author's last name, then the author's initial, the year. APA is really concerned about the year. We want to know how up to date the information is, and that makes sense because we're dealing with science-related courses and disciplines and professions. So author's last name, initial, year, the title of the book, the city where it was published, and the publisher. Okay, very similar if you have a company or government author. Again, that would go in the author position. Then you have the year, the name of the document, the city, and the publisher. Notice things like the punctuation that comes after the year, for instance. You have a period. The name of the book or the name of the document is in italics. So these kinds of things you're not expected to memorize, you're just expected to be able to follow the format. One other thing I should tell you is that consistency is very important and paying attention to detail. So, and that makes sense again in the science-related field. You don't want mistakes being made. You want to pay attention to detail. So following the guide, applying the principles, following the format, you will be on the right track for sure. So let me just show you in the guide here. So starting on page 4 to 9, starting on page 4 and going up to page 9, you'll see examples of print materials. So there, book, no author, book, 1 author, book, 2 authors, book, 3 to 5 authors. So really the key is to find the source, look at the source you've got, and determine which example it falls under. Here's an example of a chapter in an edited book, a government document, encyclopedia. Again, these are paper sources or print sources. So let's walk through referencing a book. Now this happens to be a business book, and likely you wouldn't be using APA in business, but it's the same principle for finding the information. First of all, you're determining how many authors the book has. So in this case, there's 3 authors, 1, 2, 3. So you're going to use the example from your APA guide of book, 3 authors. Okay? And you're going to keep them in the same order as they appear here. So Guffey's the first author, Rhodes, Rogan. Another piece of information you need is the year. So remember I said APA is very concerned about the year. 2010 is the year of publication. Going back, the title of the book, Business Communication, Process and Product, 3rd Brief Canadian Edition. Now this is a picky thing, but again, APA is kind of picky. Notice how they don't capitalize any of these words, and the word Canadian always gets capitalized, but they're doing it for style reasons. Don't go with what you see on the cover. Don't go with, for instance, bigger letters for the title and smaller letters for the subtitle. What you do is you take the information that's being provided and apply it into the APA format using the guide as an example. So hopefully that, oh, I forgot to tell you about the publisher. So we've got the year, we've got the date, we've got the name of the book. We need to find the city of publication. So there it is there, Toronto, and the publisher is Nelson. Okay, that was also on the front cover of the book, Nelson. Publishers like to put their names all over the place. Now one that's a little bit trickier is when you have an edited book. So unlike a book with an author or authors, an edited book is compiled by someone and each chapter has a different author. So if you're looking at that type of book, and I know for sure the nursing students use their Potter and Perry book as an example of an edited print book. Oftentimes psychology books are edited books. You have to take a look. It would say editor on the front cover, or inside the front cover it would say senior editor or editor. Otherwise, if you're just looking at a book that doesn't mention the word editor, likely it is an authored book. But if you see editor, then you're going to follow the example for referencing an article or chapter in an edited book. The difference between this and the authored book is that an edited book has a chapter author and it also has editors. So the chapter author is who wrote that particular chapter, then the year, always with APA, then the title of the chapter, then the name of the editors, the name of the book, the pages for the chapter, the city, and the publisher. So way too much information that you shouldn't be expected to memorize this. The example is in the guide, and really what you're expected to do is figure out what type of source am I looking at, and then find the example that matches in the guide, and then apply the format into your references page. So that is an overview of how you reference print sources. Okay, so moving on to electronic or web-based sources. If you take a look at your guide, starting on page 10 up to page 12, you'll see examples of web sources. So I'll just click on that now. So we've talked about print sources, now we're looking at web sources. Oftentimes students find themselves using this page maybe more than others. So what you've got on page 10 are examples of how to reference websites with authors and without, and how to reference online journal articles. Also online newspaper articles, e-books, online dictionaries, online government documents, and images. And I'll go through each one of those in the next couple of slides. So first of all, when you're looking at a document from a website, you're determining who the author is. Oftentimes that author is front and center. It will tell you right at the top who wrote it. Sometimes you have to hunt around a little bit. you're looking for an author name. Now, the author may not be an individual. That frequently happens. It could be a company, it could be the government, it could be an organization. So either you have an individual author for the source, or you have a corporate or government author, in which case you still treat it the same way. You put the company name first. In the case of an individual author, you put the author's last name and then their initials. Sometimes, really occasionally, you're going to have a document on the internet that doesn't have an author. Use those with caution. Oftentimes they may not be as credible or may not be seen as credible, and your professor may indicate that all your sources have to have authors. But if the source looks really good and it seems to be credible otherwise, and you just can't determine who the author is, then you would organize it by the title of the document. So whatever it said at the top of the web page or the document name. Always the year afterwards. And with one of the differences between looking at a web source and a print source is that you need to have the retrieval date. So once you've done the author, the year, the title, then you're going to have the retrieval date. That's the day that you went online and accessed it. So that's another good reason to keep track of your information so that you can record when you got the information. And then you're also going to have the from www. So it's not enough to just copy and paste the www. You have to provide the rest of the information for your reader so that they can locate the information that you consulted. So I'm just going to show you an example of how to reference a document from the internet. Okay, so this one clicked sort of a little bit further down the document, but what you want to do is scroll up to the top of the page to determine if you can figure out who the author is. In this case, the author is Public Safety Canada, so it's not written by a person in particular, it's written by the government. So where the author would go, you're going to put Public Safety Canada, that's going to be in the first position. Then we need to determine where or what year this was created. Okay, so we're going to scroll down to the bottom. This was created in 2012, so that's the next piece of information you're going to need. The next piece of information is the title of the document. So it's called Youth Gangs in Canada, What Do We Know? Now, if I happen to click on this PDF file instead, then the title would be different. It would be called Youth Gangs in Canada. But in this case, it's Youth Gangs in Canada, What Do We Know? So that's assuming that I'm getting information from several sections within this web page. Then I need to determine the city of publication. Well, the Government of Canada is located in Ottawa, so even though it doesn't explicitly state it, I'm going to use my common sense and say, well, Government of Canada, federal government, Ottawa is its head office, so I'm going to put Ottawa there. Then I'm going to put author, and author is, instead of indicating that the Public Safety Canada was the publisher as well as the author, I actually write the word author, A-U-T-H-O-R, to indicate that the author is also the publisher. Then I'm going to say retrieved from, and I'm going to give you the first part of this www. So I don't need to have all this other stuff at the end. I just need to have the www.publicsafety.gc.ca. Because I've provided the rest of the information, the title of the document, the year, and so on, I don't need to have the long URL. So hopefully that's clear. It helps you find the information. Generally speaking, you're going to find the information like the date at the bottom. You're often going to find the author at the top, and the publisher will often be down at the bottom as well. Another type of frequently used source is a journal article from a library database. Many of you will have been to the library and will have accessed things like Academic Search Premier or ProQuest, different databases that contain articles. So APA has a set format for referencing those articles from a library database. There are two possibilities when you're referencing an article from a library database. One is that you're going to include the www for the journal homepage. So there's a certain format. Again, it's in your library guide. You're not expected to memorize it. There's a certain format. You're always going to start with the author and the year, the title of the article, title of the journal, and so on. Here's an example of what it would look like. The other option is if your journal article has something called a DOI, and DOI stands for Digital Object Identifier. It's a system that has been developed actually in the last few years that assigns articles unique numbers and letters, sort of like a stamp almost, and a unique series of letters and numbers. Rather than having the link or www to the journal article, or sorry, the journal homepage, what this does, the DOI, is a permanent link that is assigned to some journal articles. Now, especially in the sciences, seems that more and more of the journals are using DOIs. If you are using APA and you need to find out actually if there is a DOI, you would look on the front page of the article. If you don't see a DOI on the front page of the article from a library database, then there is no DOI. It would actually indicate, it would say DOI, and then it would give you a long series of letters and numbers just like you see here. If there is no DOI, then you move to the example that was in the previous slide, which is using the www from the journal. Okay, so it's one or the other. It's either the homepage for the journal with the website or DOI, not both. Okay, and that's going to be in your library guide. It will show you both examples as well. There are other types of electronic sources, things like wikis, and I don't mean Wikipedia because normally those are not allowed as credible sources, but sometimes within a course you're creating a wiki or you're linking to other wikis and discussion boards, or it could be that you have an online dictionary. Sometimes people will go online to get definitions and so on. The APA guide does have a way of referencing other sources like that. Another thing that some people forget about is, and this is especially important in presentations, is images. If you didn't create the image, you need to give credit to that originator, going back to that very first principle of why referencing is important. So you need to give credit to the originator of that material. If you don't, say where you got the information from, then that's plagiarism. So whether you're using an image in a report or in a presentation, you need to give credit to that person. So the format that you'll see it's in the APA guide as well, but basically you're looking always for an author. Sometimes that's not possible when you're looking at images. You don't know who created the image. A year, sometimes that information is missing as well. But for sure what you can do is either have the title of the image or a description of the image, and also the type of image. So whether it was an oil painting or a schematic drawing or a flow chart, if you didn't create the image, you need to tell us where it came from and describe it, and then tell us what type of image it is. And then you also tell us the retrieve from, and you say www.Google Images or wherever it is you got it from. Sometimes, and this happens with web material, sometimes information doesn't have a date, so you scroll down to the bottom like I suggested, you're looking for the date because you know that's important in APA, and there is no date. Be careful about using those sources, just like you want to be careful about using sources that don't have authors. But if the source seems otherwise good, and maybe you even get your professor's approval to go ahead with it, if there is no date, then you put N period, D period. So rather than just leaving it out, which actually makes you look careless, you put ND, and that indicates to your reader, I looked, there is no date. I couldn't find a date. Okay, so that's still following APA format, author always first, date second, but if there is no date, you're going to put ND. So that covers references. I want to move on to in-text citations. The other part of APA is what are called in-text citations, and those go right in the body of your paper, and they correspond with the items on your references page. You're going to do in-text citations whether you've quoted or paraphrased or summarized or provided statistics or an image. I just talked about that. In the in-text citation, you're going to have the author's last name, the year, and the page number. So here's an example of some text from a book, and maybe I'm looking at this paragraph here about communicating through nonverbal messages. And there's a piece of information in here that I think, wow, I think I really want to quote that. Or maybe I want to paraphrase it, which is putting it into my own words, or I want to summarize it. Regardless, this is not my idea. I have to give credit to the authors of this source. The authors of this source happen to be the authors of the cover that I showed you before, Guffey, Rhodes, and Rogan. So what I'm doing in my research notes is I'm recording where I got my information from, the name of the book, the year, the authors, and so on. Then I'm keeping track that this is on page 57 because I'll need that information for my in-text citation. So when I'm using that information, I need to clearly signal that, hey, this is not my idea. I want to clearly indicate where I got my information from. There's a few ways to do it. You can put your author's name right in your sentence. So you could put Guffey, Rhodes, and Rogan, or in this case, Wilson, immediately after that author. And this is one of the things that makes APA different from other sources or other citation methods, is that when you put the author, you have to put the year immediately afterwards. So you can see the example, Wilson, 2010, there's my author, year. Then I'm going to choose a verb that sort of signals what it is that Wilson said. Did Wilson explain, disprove, conclude, note, and so on? So I'm going to use the author, the year, a particular verb, and then the piece of information. Finally, the in-text citation involves putting the page number. So here's an example of a sentence. In his study of high school teachers, Wilson, 2010, concludes, and I didn't write the information here, but at the end of that information, I'm going to put the page number and a period. Okay? So when you are quoting or paraphrasing or summarizing, it's important to indicate within your sentence where you got your information from. Another option is you can actually put the author's names right at the end of your sentence. And you can see that here. So this applies whether you're quoting or paraphrasing or summarizing. We'll start with quotations first. When you quote, you're taking a direct statement word for word from a source. So you haven't changed any of the words, you have copied it exactly. You must use quotation marks around that quoted material, and you have to keep the wording the same. What's going to happen is you're going to either put the in-text citation immediately after that quotation, or you're going to do, as I did in the previous slide, and write the author's name and year in your sentence, and then just have the page number at the end. So you can see the material, and I quoted it from page 57. Nonverbal communication includes all written and unspoken messages, both intentional and unintentional. There's my quotation marks around the quote. In brackets, authors, there's 3 of them, year, page number. Notice even that the period goes after the bracket, which is after the in-text citation. Another option is I can say communication can occur both verbally and non-verbally. Guffey, Rhodes, and Rogan, so I can mention the author's names right in my sentence, put the year immediately after, then do my quotation and put the page number at the end. They're both totally acceptable. Authors and year and page at the end, or authors and year in the sentence and page number at the end. It's completely up to you. Some people prefer the second method because they feel it makes their writing flow. Either one is acceptable, and sometimes it's actually nice to switch it up and sometimes do it all in parentheses, other times put the author and the year right in your sentence. So that's when you're quoting. Now those were short quotes. Another option is when you have a long quotation, and you want to be very careful that you're not over quoting. But when you have a long quote, which is about 40 words or more, you're going to set it up a little bit differently. I'll give you a second to take a look at it and see if you can spot the differences. So first of all, when you're doing a long quote, you mention the author, you mention the year. So you sort of lead into the quote. So I've gone May 2009 reminds the reader, and then I put a colon. That's a way to introduce my quote. Now I have my quote, and I have my page number at the end. You'll notice that there are no quotation marks for a long quote. You'll also notice that it's got a hanging indent, so everything is tabbed in. That's to make it set apart from the rest of the page. Okay? You can't overuse long quotes. Some professors actually won't allow them at all because quoting doesn't really show that you understand the material, and if you just go, oh, long quote, I think I'll do a bunch of those, it doesn't really show your reader that you understand the material. So sometimes if they're allowed, they're not allowed very often. But if you are going to use a long quotation, if your professor says it's okay, then this is the way it would be set up. So I've talked about quoting with APA. You also have to reference when you make a paraphrase statement. A paraphrase is when you take information from the original source, so we'll go back to that Guffey, Rhodes, and Rogan example, and you put it into your own words. Paraphrasing takes more time than quoting, because quoting is really just copying, but paraphrasing takes more time to demonstrate your understanding. With paraphrasing, you don't use quotation marks. You make sure your in-text citation is really close beside the paraphrased material. And one little caution, APA doesn't actually require that you include the page number when you paraphrase. They recommend it. I usually say to students, just put the page number. If you've got the page number from your 300-page textbook and you're taking a sentence and rewording it, you might as well provide the page number. It makes it easier for your reader. It's more consistent as well. So even though APA doesn't require a page number when you paraphrase, it can't hurt. Sometimes what happens too, I should mention this, is that when you're on a website, you don't have page numbers. So some professors like it when you put things like paragraph number or section. But if there aren't page numbers or there isn't a clear way to distinguish where you got your information from, usually the author and the year is sufficient. So here's the example of the paraphrase. Notice that I've reworded it. It's not in quotation marks, but my in-text citation looks exactly the same as from when I quoted. Guffey, Rhodes, and Rogan, 2010, P57, which stands for page 57. Okay, so whether I've quoted, and that's when I've used quotation marks and kept the words exactly the same, or I've paraphrased, which is when I've reworded it, both cases I need to have my in-text citation right beside the information. As well, when you summarize information, so a summary is when you take information, maybe a paragraph, and just pull out the main idea. You condense the information. With a summary, just like a paraphrase, you don't use quotation marks. You put the in-text citation right beside the summarized material. And again, even though APA doesn't require the page number, it's recommended. Okay, so here's the example down below, Guffey, Rhodes, and Rogan, 2010. So in this case, I've chosen to write the authors right in my sentence. Note that both verbal and nonverbal messages influence communication. And then I've put my page number at the end. This one is a summary of that idea, main idea from that paragraph. I haven't quoted it. I've put it into my own words, but I have referenced it. Now this sometimes is a tricky situation. Sometimes you're reading a source and you find a really good quotation, but the author of that quotation is not the author of the source you're looking at. So let me back up a little bit. If you were taking a look at a book written by Langdon, okay, and that book was about Bill Gates, or the author, Langdon, quoted Bill Gates, you have to be careful how you reference this, because what you're actually doing is quoting a quote. So for instance, you would mention Gates' name because he's the one who came up with the idea for a particular business plan, let's say. So we've got Gates' business plan, and then in APA we use this. We say as cited in, and we mention the author and the year. This is where I saw the information. Okay, Gates' business plan, as cited in Langdon 2011. So what this means is that Langdon is the source, and here's the year, of where I read about Gates' business plan, or where I read about what Gates said about his business plan. So what I'm doing is giving credit to Gates, but I'm telling my reader where I saw it. Okay, this is in the library guide as well. Towards the end of the guide, it shows you how to quote a quote. Another option is to go back and look for a Gates source yourself that is the original source, the primary source of where Gates provided his information. But that's not always possible or practical. So if you do this correctly, you would say Gates, that's who wrote it, or that's who said it, but this is where I saw it as cited in Langdon 2011. Okay, so only Langdon would be on your references page, not Gates. I'll just touch on this quickly, that APA has headings, and they actually have 5 heading levels. Most of the reports and assignments and labs you'll be doing won't require you to use all 5. Those are usually for really, really long documents and manuscripts. But on the next slide, you'll see what the 5 headings look like. The types of headings that you'll likely be using would be a first level heading, which is where you center and bold and upper and lower case the title of your document, for instance, or the word references is a level 1 heading. If you have a subheading, maybe it looks like this. It's sort of more to the left margin. You want to be consistent when you're using headings. You don't have to, you don't want to mix them up. You don't want to sometimes have your subtitle looking like this and then other times having it looking like number 5. So you want to be consistent when you're using your headings and subheadings. You can always go back and ask your professor too what the requirements are for headings, because each assignment and each professor usually has different requirements of how it's supposed to be set up. So some thoughts about APA format. APA requires you to double space between all lines of text on the title page when using headings, quotations, etc. It's a very plain font, Times New Roman, something like that, 12-point size, 1-inch margins all the way around. So you want to make sure that you're double spacing at the end of each sentence, but you're single spacing between other punctuation marks. Okay, now the information that I've presented to you today is based on what the APA manual says. It's really important that you always check with your professor regarding any special instructions. Some professors have special instructions for title pages or spacing or headings and so on. You want to make sure that you're double checking the requirements. Your professor may have requirements for the types of sources you're allowed to use or how many quotations you're allowed to have. So you want to follow APA format, but you want to follow the expectations that your professor's laid out. Here's an example of an APA cover page. I find that most professors don't, they want other information. So in an APA cover page, you would have the page number in the top right corner. In the middle, you would have the name of your document, your name, that happens to be my name, and the name of the college, and then something called a running head. And a running head appears on each page, and it's sort of a shortened version of the title. Generally speaking, you would be providing, most professors want a page number or page numbers. Most of them also want information such as your student number, the date you're submitting it, maybe the assignment number, and so on. So go back and double check with your professor about cover page requirements. Finally, I want to just give you some information about some resources that you might find helpful when you're working through APA. One of them is the APA Style Guide from the library. I've showed it to you several times. You can pick it up at the reference desk. It's very, very helpful, and as I said, it's not required that you memorize the rules, it's that you use the guide and this workshop content to help you understand and apply the format. You can buy the APA manual. I don't think most students require it. It's about $40 and it has several hundred pages of rules in it. Normally students find that with the workshop that we just went through, as well as the guide from the library, you're usually absolutely fine. I'd also recommend you go to the SALS website, and you can click on the button above and check out some of the writing related resources and learning skills resources. You'll find information about referencing, including this presentation, also information about essay writing and research notes and so on. So I think you'll find the information there very helpful. There's also a document on there called Top Tips for Avoiding Plagiarism. You can come into SALS and pick it up, as you can pick up any of the research notes, forms, and so on. Top Tips for Avoiding Plagiarism covers the important concepts of what plagiarism is and how using your particular citation style is essential. Also, we have peer writing tutors at SALS. They're available to help or clarify some concepts. The writing specialist at SALS and also the ESL specialist at SALS are there to help you out as well. Your professor, of course, is a very good resource person, and that's the person really you should start with them to get clarification on what's being asked of you and to find out any special instructions for referencing. If you do have any other questions or you want to make an appointment, you can always call the SALS office or you can email SALS and someone will get back to you. Good luck with your referencing, and I hope you found the material helpful.